Okay. You remember last week we talked about the importance of the prophets, and if you had read most of the chapter uh, that I sent out a note on my email said it'd be nice to read the entire chapter. It's not that long, so that the events are more in context, and then all of a sudden you realize the importance that the prophets played. These kings all had advisors, they all had counselors, then they had generals, but the prophets had significant influence. And that continues a little bit today as well. Even though it's not the focus of these sessions, you need to keep that in mind. Um, let's see here. First thing I'm going to share is the King's document. I think everybody can see that. Just note a couple of things. We're still going to be in Israel. Next week we'll begin with Judah, but we're still in Israel, and we just basically finished up at Ahab. Notice that Ahaziah comes next, who was replaced by Jehoram. Notice that Ahaziah's reign began at 853. Jehoram's reign began 4 years later. Ahaziah was replaced by Jehoram. In Judah, Jehoram was replaced by Ahaziah. These are different people. So it can be very confusing. They're totally different people from different tribes even, but they all have the same name. So that can be confusing. Today, we're going to pick up after Ahab, basically, and we're going to go through all the rest of these kings in rapid pace till the beginning of the Assyrian conquest and the exile, which essentially ends the kingdom of Israel. So it can be a little bit confusing. This is a hard one. I'll give you a heads up. This particular lesson is hard to follow, but the King's document will help you a little bit if you want to glance at that. Okay, so we'll start with this map here too. All right. The outcome of Ahab's campaign against the Arameans that we talked about last week was rather indecisive. And then, of course, of his death on the battlefield at Ramoth Gilead, and then the subsequent general feeling that both the Judeans and the Israelites both had because they left the battlefield, basically. Because of that, Mesha, who was the king of Moab, decided this is a perfect time to rise and revolt to liberate his country from Israelite control. And his feats are described in detail on the famous stele, which he erected after his final victory. And this stele was discovered only about 100 years ago near ancient Dibon in Moab. And here's the town of Dibon located right here. That's where they discovered the stele about 100 years ago. From this source, the stele, insofar as it substantiates the events that are mentioned in the Bible, we learn that Mesha did not stop at the borders of his kingdom when he tried to bring his kingdom back under his control, but he crossed the Arnon River, located here in the north, and he crossed the Zered River in the south, trying to expand his domains. And he captured the towns and settlements in the Mishor, which is the lower hill country of Gilead, and to a lesser degree, some of the towns that are located in northern Edom. King Ahaziah's accidental fall through a palace window left him a sick man for the larger part of his 2-year reign. And it was only when his brother Jehoram succeeded him around 850 BC that Israel started to regain its confidence and begin the reconquest of Moab. So, Roger, if you got 2 Kings 3, 7 through 9.
Okay. He also sent this message to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab? I will go with you, he replied. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. But what route shall we attack? He asked. Through the desert of Edom, he answered. So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. After a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals with them.
Okay, so from this passage, we learn a couple of things. Number one, the old Israelite Judean alliance was still functioning. They were still separate kingdoms, but they were still partners. We know from the Mesha Stele that the king of Judah was not only fulfilling his treaty obligation, but was very much an interested party, since Mesha had occupied part of Edom, which was a Judean dependency, and in fact, Edom was ruled by a Judean governor during this time. So it's not surprising that the king of Edom, who was under the control of Judah, basically, joined in with the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat, and the king of Israel, Jehoram, in this particular campaign to push Moab back across their borders. The expedition force, including foot soldiers as well as chariots, and its senior commanders, it was commanded by Jehoram, in spite of his youth. His planning displays some imagination and daring, since the direct approach over the river Jordan at Adam or some other ford and then into Moab would be the obvious route. And if you recall, Adam was a city located up here on the Jordan River, north of Jericho. It was Adam where the soft soil of the banks fell across the Jordan and blocked the flow, if you remember. One of the fording places. In fact, there was a bridge there. And there are other fording places here. So this seemed obvious for Israel, located here, to cross the Jordan in the north and attack Moab from the north. That seemed kind of obvious. Instead, he decided on an indirect approach, attacking Moab from the south. The Jordan area has always been the scene of border raids and clashes. Mesha made its refortification one of his first concerns, and he seems to have placed the area in a high state of military preparedness. But he did so at the expense of the additional defense of his southern frontier. So the approaches to which he knew would be the most difficult because of the severe topography and the severe climate of the region, he didn't pay a whole lot of attention to refortifying the southern approaches. Jehoram planned on exactly this neglect of Moab's defenses in the south. The fate of the raids in World War I against Amman and Assault, where superbly trained British forces were severely mauled by the Turkish defenders, shows the difficulties involved in fighting in this particular terrain. Besides, in Jehoram's time, the only major passage over the Arnon River was effectively blocked against major troop movements by the newly fortified town of Aroer, located right here. So this was really the only way to cross the Arnon River, and this newly fortified town was effectively blocking that route. Consequently, Jehoram chose the calculated risk of a desert match. In spite of his vulnerability to desert raiders and the difficulty of providing water for his men and horses, we don't know the strength of the combined expeditionary force, but a reasonable estimate is about 35,000 men and some 400 horses. Now let's compare that to a 20,000 strong expeditionary force over a 14-day period. Water supply was carried by 5,000 camels during the Turkish attack on the Suez Canal in 1915, while another 2,500 camels carried the rest of the supplies. So the Allies in this particular instance in 849 BC could not have done with less than half the total amount of the camels that the Turks had used in 1915. These, of course, needed water for themselves, as did the live cattle that were driven behind the army to serve as a supply of fresh food during their desert march. The extent of the turning movement and the sector where the Allies wheeled in a northerly direction and began to penetrate Moabite held territory can be estimated with the aid of two biblical passages. The first is 2 Kings 3, verse 9, which Roger just read, that very last verse. If you could read that last verse again, Roger, just verse 9.
So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. After a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals with them.
So we learn here that the approach march took 7 days. The second passage is 2 Kings 3, 16 through 20. Ken?
Okay. And he said, "This is what the Lord says. I will fill this valley with pools of water. For this is what the Lord says. You will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink. This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. He will also deliver Moab into your hands. You will overthrow every fortified city and every major town. You will cut down every good tree, stop up all the springs, and ruin every good field with stones." The next morning, about the time for offering the sacrifice, there it was, water flowing from the direction of Edom, and the land was filled with water.
So when the Allies were in dire straits because of an acute water shortage, they were saved by sudden flooding of a nearby wadi caused by the rains that were occurring in the mountains of Edom. And these rains were so far away in the mountains that you couldn't see the clouds and you couldn't hear it. There was no telltale signs whatsoever. But obviously the water started to flow. Now, this is not all that an unusual phenomenon. If you've ever lived out has anybody ever lived out west, like in Arizona, Texas? You're familiar with this. It happens all the time. There are a lot of dry riverbed crossings with sticks to show you the depth of the water, and you look at it and shake your head and go, who are they kidding? This is nothing but dust. But a sudden downpour, a rainfall, 30, 40 miles away will fill that gorge with rushing water in a couple of hours. It's an amazing sight. I mean, I've seen it myself when I lived in Texas. So it's not all that unusual for that phenomena to occur. And the region that is topographically and climatically most likely to yield that phenomena of this type is the sloping southeastern portion of the plateau of Edom. If we figure an average of 15 miles a day, starting all the way back in Samaria, which is off the north part of this map, the capital of Israel, for the approach march of the Allied army that included the herds of live cattle, food, water for men, horses, oxen, etc., we come up just in this area and close to where the Desert Fringe Road bypasses the head of the Zered River. Kalat El Hassa was a town that was built here in the Middle Ages to protect this passage. It seems unlikely, though, that Jehoram would have taken all the risks involved in the southern approach only to have it lead him to the natural obstacle of the Zered River and the towns that guarded its banks and the surrounding area. A deep outflanking movement was the only logical solution, the more so since, remember, the Edomites were now fighting with them, and this was their territory. So the Edomites were certainly knowledgeable about the water sources that are available in these parts. Whatever the reasons for the lack of water, a miraculous downpour saved the attackers, and after successfully defeating the Moabites, they shut up Mesha in the strong fortress here at Kir Hareset, elsewhere called Kir Moab. Today, it's present-day Kerek. Kerek's extremely favorable location made it one of the strongest forts of the realm back during the Crusader period, and it was famous for the many long sieges that it withstood successfully. There were some setbacks, but the Allied siege did make progress. And when it became a crisis, Misha attempted a massive breakout at the head of 700 hand-picked soldiers. For his breakthrough, he chose what he considered to be the most vulnerable part of the siege around his city, and that sector was held by the king of Edom and his conscripts. But even there, he was beaten back. And in this hour of general disaster and last hope, he took his oldest child, who was next in line to be king, and he offered him as a sacrifice. So, Jim, you got 2 Kings 3:27.
I think I
I
have
do.
that one.
That's Pat's, right?
No,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think I have that one.
Oh, okay.
Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew and returned to their own land.
Okay. So, upon witnessing this extremely horrible act, according to the Bible, the Israelites broke off action and terminated the campaign. There's no factual explanation about why the sudden abrupt end to so costly and so meticulously prepared campaign just on the verge of final and complete success. However, child sacrifice has been known in the ancient East as an act performed in extremis because of imminent plague. And some scholars believe that because of the siege that was the city that was surrounded, suggested that plague probably had broken out in the besieged town of Kerech, and that by this desperate act of Misha, hoped to exorcise the evil spirits and stop it from spreading. The Allies, afraid of catching the plague, thought it wisest to disengage as quickly as possible. So that was a common thing back during that period, that child sacrifice was made to hold off spread of the plague. Another explanation could be that Misha believed in child sacrifice as a last resort to avert the anger of his gods, but by performing the act, he unwittingly gave the impression of the Allies that plague had broken out, when it may not have been plague at all. And so they broke camp and left. The retreat from Moab did a lot to cancel the achievements of the first phases of that war, and Misha succeeded in preserving his independence and eventually regained all the strongholds he had lost. Although the retreat from Moab did not damage the sound structure of ancient Israel's military strength or the political alliances between the sister kingdoms and those between the sister kingdoms and Tyre to the north, it was a humiliating experience. But there may have been a different reason altogether for this rapid, complete termination of the Allied campaign. A full-scale war on more than one front has always been avoided whenever possible, even by the great powers of the ancient East. And it could be that the decision to break off the Moabite campaign was prompted not only by what they perceived to be the menace of contracting the plague from stricken Moabites, but rather by war preparations that they saw were going on by the Arameans to their north. The Bible speaks, for instance, of Damascene raiding parties. One such party captured the little girl who became a servant in the household of Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria. So who's got 2 Kings 5:2?
I do. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served as Naaman's wife.
So Israel's natural strategic advantage was its interior lines, and merely by retracing its steps back from Moab, it was simultaneously strengthening the front against Damascus. Yet the Syrians had made good use of the years without a threat of Israelite offensive activities, and before they could be stopped, they went over to the attack. Famine and death impeded the feeding of the Israelite forces, and a Syrian offensive thrust brought the Damascenes right up to the gates of Samaria, only to beat a hasty retreat because of Jehoram's successful political maneuvering. So let me switch to this map. And you notice on this map all the references to another important prophet, Elijah. Here's Elijah's hometown here. Elijah provides water in the battle against Moab. Elijah's taken up, cleanses the spring, the chariots of fire, Elijah on Mount Carmel. Elijah raises a dead boy. So there's a lot of references to Elijah on this map here. Having experienced firsthand the compelling force of a threat to his rear, Jehoram, king of Israel, sought and found an understanding with his enemy's neighbors, the kings of the Hittites. We haven't talked a whole lot about the Hittites. The Hittites are to the north of Assyria. They're up in basically Asia Minor. The tables were now turned on the Damascenes, and just as they had exploited Israel's war with the Moabites, Jehoram now utilized their entanglement with their northern neighbors to mount an attack on the Syrian rear. The kings of Israel and Judah therefore decided to renew Ahab's struggle before he died to recapture northeastern Gilead and the region of Ramoth. The preference given to the Damascenes over the Moabs makes good strategic sense. Damascus was a stronger, much more dangerous enemy. And once the Arameans were beaten and the Gileadite border safely established on the Yarmouk River here, then the field would be wide open for them to go back to an attack on Moab at a later date. So the second Allied campaign to take Ramoth Gilead, remember the first one was last week, was a sign that the offensive capability of the two sister kingdoms had not been permanently damaged, nor were their spirits diminished. But when Jehoram was wounded not far from where his father had received his fatal injury, he had to withdraw from the fighting to recuperate at his palace in Jezreel. And when he did that, a revolt broke out in the Allied camps. There was a long simmering discontent of those who resented both the autocratic tendencies and the foreign cultural and religious practices that were overtaking the country. And these factors, obviously, Elijah tried to point this out to get them back on the right path. But these factors were at least partly unavoidable byproducts of Israel's international obligations and their standing in relations with foreigners. The opposition naturally focused on the king. To Elijah, the Phoenician alliance, remember the Phoenicians are on the northern coast of the Mediterranean here, the Phoenician alliance with their religious and cultural influence exercised by the intermarriage between the royal houses of Israel and Tyre. Remember, Ahab's son married Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Tyre. We mentioned that last week. This influence was steadily spreading from Israel down to Judah. And as a consequence of the alliance between the two kingdoms, and more so as Joram of Judah, father of the reigning king Ahaziah, had married Princess Athaliah, Ahab's daughter. So the prophet Elijah chose Jehu as captain of the king's host, and from among the commanding officers assembled in the camp outside of Ramoth Gilead, and he anointed him king over Israel. You remember during the period of the judges, The judges were responsible for anointing the current leader at any given time. This was before the United Monarchy. Well, as you can see here, the prophets still had a great deal of influence. Jehu subsequently assassinated Jehoram and Ahaziah. He jumped on his horse or chariot, don't know which, and he rode madly. He was known for always riding with the pedal to the metal through the Harod Valley into the valley of Jezreel, and he shot with arrows Ahaziah and Jehoram and killed them, and threw Jezebel out the window, killed her. And then he went on a rampage to wipe out any vestiges of Baal worship. Unfortunately, he still maintained some of the idol worship and never fully went back to the right way that Elijah was seeking. So this began a 35-year decline for both Jewish kingdoms, actually, Judah and Israel. And by his deed, Jehu broke the traditional alliances with Tyre, and he broke the traditional alliance with Judah. Now he's too weak to withstand the mounting Syrian pressure alone. So he called upon the assistance of Shalmaneser of Assyria. But this step only increased Jehu's isolation, because we learn from the Assyrian annals that the coalition of the Syrian rulers against Shalmaneser did not break up after the Karkar campaign. Remember last week in the Orontes Valley, the Karkar campaign? And that 3 more times, in 849, 848, and 845 BC, Shalmaneser was successfully beaten back by the allied Syrian forces. But Israel did not participate in these campaigns. It was too weak, or at least not with any force worth mentioning. The strictly neutral attitude of the Israelite king in these conflicts was in itself a contribution to the common cause. It permitted the Syrians to concentrate all their available forces against the Assyrians, and with Israel as a major partner to Assyria, the Assyrian rear was secure from any attack from Israel. But all this was lost once Jehu had openly and of his own free will declared to be a partner with Assyria. So once the Assyrian tide had for the time being been beaten back, Hazael, the new ruler of Damascus, spared no effort to crush the threat to his rear before the Assyrians could renew their attacks. I know this is hard to follow. Okay, Hazael, the new ruler of Damascus, which is off the map here. Hazael was now the central figure among the Syrian leaders, while the Jewish sister kingdoms, true to the old saying, united we stand, divided we fall, were at the lowest point of their power. In a series of campaigns, Israel was ravaged. Parts of its territory were incorporated in the Damascene kingdom, and the rest of the country, and Judah as well, were made tributary to Hazael. Only the Arameans' reluctance to become enmeshed in mountain warfare saved the kingdom from complete conquest. Once more, the natural mountain fortresses of the mountains of Judah and Ephraim, or Samaria here, permitted the Jews to bide their time, while in Assyria, the preparations for the conquest of the eastern Mediterranean, including the Sharon Plain, from the Taurus Mountains all the way down to the Nile River in Egypt, were completed. The period of external defeats and danger to the very existence of the Jewish state had produced a spiritual and a moral revival, which was preceded by a period of soul searching among the priests and the laymen. While in the north, the fiery prophet Elijah tried to imbue king and country with religious zeal and Jewish consciousness, down in the south, the high priesthood of Judah brought about a cultural revolution and revival that was carried on by Jehoash, who reigned for 38 years. The more complete and social revival, which was aided by Judah's topographically more secure position, enabled Amaziah, the son of Joash, to take the initiative even before the Israelites. In his war against the Edomites were once more reduced to a vassaldom, and the trade routes from Eilat and Sela, later Petra, through the Negev to the Mediterranean were reopened again. While the blessing of the dying Elijah in about 790 BC, or with his blessing, Jehoash embarked on the reconquest of the territories that were lost to Damascus. In 3 campaigns, the power of the Arameans was broken. The main focus of the decisive combat was Aphek, which is on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, right about here. From there, the Israelites outflanked the traditional routes to Damascus and the ridges that were served as natural lines of defense down to the Yom Kippur War of 1973 by pushing out towards the east and approaching the enemy capital of Damascus along the desert fringes. Let's look at show all. Here we go. Is it the right one? I don't think that's the right one. This one. Yeah. There we go. Everybody see that one?
Yes.
Here's some rather detailed information about the prophets Amos, Hosea, and Jonah. Oh, that reminds me, Bonnie, were you able to get this book?
I have not ordered yet. I have a birthday coming up and it's on my wish list.
Hint, 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 hint. Okay.
Bill, you got it easy.
I may look dumb, but I got that.
And this map depicts where these prophets basically operated. Amos, Hosea, Jonah, for example. So that's, like I said, it's not the focus of these lessons, but it's really typical information. And again, I keep coming back, the important role that the prophets had in relations with whoever the current king happened to be. The main base for this move that we're talking about now, let me zoom in a little bit, was the town of Carnium, located right here. Its capture was a necessary prerequisite to the approach from the east. The prophet Amos had preserved for us in his generation's consciousness of the crucial importance of this achievement for subsequent developments. And the prophet Amos also mentions Lo Devar as the second crucial point to be taken by the Israelites. Its location in the foothills of northwestern Gilead proves that the victory here was the preliminary step to the reconquest of Ramoth Gilead and the Ramoth region in general, and the rest of Gilead, which in turn may be safely assumed to have paved the way for the reconquest of Ammon and Moab and Edom. How much of these actions after the Aphek victory was achieved by Jehoash or is attributed to his son Jeroboam II is kind of open to argument because it's not clear in the Bible. The combined reigns of Jeroboam and Uzziah now, it was the king of Judah, not Israel. Uzziah are to be considered as the second golden age of biblical Israel. Jeroboam occupied Damascus, up to the north here. Jeroboam occupied Damascus and he reestablished his border at Lebo Hamath on the Orontes River, where the Battle of Karkar took place. And during the almost 45 years of his reign, the Israelites, as well as their neighbors, grew accustomed to this idea that Israel was once again the foremost power in Syria. When Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam II, was murdered in, to us, unknown circumstances, it seemed only natural that Uzziah of Judah, King Uzziah of Judah, would step into his place and become the head of the Syrian rulers, all the Syrian rulers, who were learning to bury the hatchet and combine their forces against Assyria's renewed preparations for another invasion. The prophet Amos was active during the lifetime of Jeroboam, when Israel was at its peak. His preaching starkly illuminates the causes of Israel's subsequent downfall, the sudden change from misery and weakness up to where they are now, the position of foremost military power, created a false sense of self-reliance and security. The gathering military threat went unheeded to their north, while the social gap between the haves and the have-nots really sapped the spirit and had contributed so much to, which had contributed so much to the ascendancy of the Israelite host over its enemies. When Zechariah was murdered by Shalom, the stage was set for a series of palace revolutions. And if you look at that king's document, you see that none of these guys were in charge for very long. The quick turnover of governments disrupted the continuity and the stability of strategic planning and political activities. The prophet Hosea describes this situation by calling Israel a silly dove without heart. So who's got the next reading? Hosea 7, verse 11.
Ephraim is like a dove, easily deceived and senseless, now calling to Egypt, now turning to Assyria.
So there was total confusion, total indecision. I mean, here they are looking this way to Egypt and looking this way to the north and back and forth. They didn't know what to do with themselves anymore. They lost their way. And it's possible that this political indecision was the reason why Israel did not join the coalition that had formed under the leadership of Uzziah in the south, King Uzziah of Judah. The biblical text is silent on this, but we have the severely mutilated Assyrian inscriptions that were found at Keilah on the Euphrates to rely upon. The outcome of the battle that raged in northern Syria was at best indecisive. Within a year or two, 738 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III, sometimes referred to as Pul in the Bible, P-U-L, was able to invade the whole of Syria and levy a heavy tribute, even from Israel and Judah. Rezon, who was the king of Damascus at this time now, Hazael is gone, was quick to seize this chance, and his troops charged down as far south as Eilat, and because of Israel's indecisiveness, enabled Damascus to gain control over the whole King's Highway. Here's Damascus, the whole King's Highway here on the desert fringe, all the way down. And here is the southernmost tip of Israel at Eilat. Remember on the Gulf of Aqaba, Etzon Geba, Eilat. So now the Assyrians controlled the entire length of the King's Highway. For the first time in biblical history, economic implications aside, the Arameans could now, not the Assyrians, the Arameans could now move and deploy their forces as they wished all along the eastern border of both Judah and Israel. While Israel accepted willy-nilly the status of a de facto Damascene satellite state, Judah balked at an enforced alliance with King Rezon and Pekah against Assyria. Pekah ben Ramallah, who was a senior officer, revolted against Pekahiah, the reigning monarch. Pekah was a Gileadite, and his ascendancy was typical of the increasing importance of Gilead and its men had assumed in the Israelite kingdom. appealing to his countrymen, the Gileadites, who were conscious of their historic primacy over the Cisjordanians and their economic as well as their military importance. Pekah used a company of Gileadites to overthrow and kill his king and master. To strengthen his hold over Israel, he must have moved additional units from their permanent stations in Gilead, thus throwing it wide open now to aggression from Damascus. Let me pop in this map real quick for a short peek. Here you see Pekah of Israel and Rezon of Damascus joining forces together against King Ahaz, the king of Judah. Did it come up?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So Rezon, the king of Damascus, and Pekah, the king of Israel, formed an alliance to depose Ahaz, the king of Judah. Pekah, in desperation, declared his complete subjugation to Tiglath-Pileser, who in turn used the opportunities offered by Israel's evident dismemberment to launch an offensive against the Syro-Palestinian coast that went as far south as the borders of Egypt, present-day El Arish. Remember where the Brook of Egypt opens into the Gulf of the Mediterranean Sea. And you can see here that, remember, the Philistines, true to their nature, whenever Israel or Judah were weakened, what did they do? They would renew their attacks. One more map. So Tiglath-Pileser, who was only too glad to use the pretext of coming to the rescue of his hard-pressed vassal in Israel, in a series of campaigns between 734 and 732 BC, the whole of Syria and Palestine were conquered. Assyrian stone reliefs depicting the battles proved that the Assyrian armies were even more diversified than before. New types of arms and equipment had been added, both for attack in the open field and for the siege of fortified places. The defeats suffered by Tiglath-Pileser's enemies were so crushing, and the Assyrian resources were so well geared to the national war effort that he decided to turn all of the conquered territories into permanent provinces. All Syria east of the tributary, Phoenician coast in the north, including Damascus, the Sharon coast, Galilee, Gilead, were all divided into provinces which became integral parts of the Assyrian Empire. Israel was reduced to a vassaldom within the confines of the mountains of Samaria. The fate of Judah was similar. To weaken Israel further, Tiglath-Pileser exiled to Assyria 13,500 Israelites from those walks of life that were essential for any further war effort. In other words, he removed Israel's ability to ever wage war again by exiling 13,500 people who would be able to assist with such an effort. Pekah did not survive this debacle. He was deposed by Hoshea ben Elah, who began his reign as an Assyrian vassal. The basic urge for independence reasserted itself once more, and the now tiny Israel, banking on its traditionally high political prestige, secretly began to conspire against Assyria. Next reading, 2 Kings 17:4.
That's me.
Okay.
But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to Soyah, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him and put him.
Okay, so the biblical narrative is either incomplete or inconsistent. If Hoshea had foolishly decided to defy Shalmaneser V, Tiglath-Pileser's successor, solely on his own, he cannot have been foolhardy enough to entrust himself without a struggle into the hands of the Assyrian authorities. Betrayal is a more plausible explanation. Betrayal without sufficient proof, or otherwise, Hoshea would have been put to death immediately. Another possibility is that in the hope that his country might be spared the full vengeance of Assyria, Hoshea decided to sacrifice his own person and give himself up. Whatever the cause, Samaria was left in its final hour without its king and without its leader. The next reading, 2 Kings 17:5.
Got it. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years.
Okay. So whatever deeds and the valor, the persistence and all the suffering that made up this saga of a 3-year siege of Samaria has actually been lost to posterity. We don't have any of that information. Yet by its length alone, the siege of Samaria does rank with some of the most famous last stands against overwhelming odds in the annals of antiquity. Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, itself withstood Nabopolassar for less than 2 years. Carthage fell to the Romans after 3 years, about the same time as Syria had held out. Alexander the Great captured Tyre after 7 months, and the Roman general Marcellus reduced Syracuse after 2 years. Among the longest sieges of the modern period was that of Sevastopol in 1854 and 1855, which lasted 11 months, and that of Paris in 1870 and 71, which lasted 132 days. The actual conquest of Samaria is credited to Sargon II, who entered the town in 722 to 721 BC. Major portions of the population of the 10 tribes that made up Israel were exiled. But here's the important thing. They were exchanged with Gentile settlers from Syria and Mesopotamia. So in this way, Israel was finally subdued. It wasn't actually on my list, but it might be helpful to look at this one map as soon as I bring it up after I clear my screen. I think you've seen this map before, but it would be good to look at it again. This map here, you've seen this before, but this sort of brings it home. Here's the after the fall of Israel, the Israelite kingdom is no more. This is the Assyrian Empire. Great portions of Asia Minor, all of former Babylon, all the way down through Egypt. But notice two things. Notice Judah. Judah remained somewhat independent. Assyria, with all its might, was not able to completely conquer what was left, what's not very big now, but what was left of Judah, because of the mountainous terrain around Jerusalem. They were able to withstand attacks. The other thing is, here's the Orontes. We talked about that a few times. Notice this pale blue area located up here. This is the area where the Israelites were exiled to. This is where they were forced to move to and live for many decades before they were allowed to return after Assyria as an empire crumbled. The Persians, who took their place, basically allowed the former Israelites to return back to their lands. Okay. Well, this is a hard one. Like I said, we covered a lot of kings in a short amount of time, and sometimes it's hard to follow. But I hope the King's document was a little help. So, are there any questions? You know, this is number 8, and we only got 5 more to go. Holy cow!
Well, summer's gone already.
Yeah. Well, let me stop the recording.